So SQUIP is a section of the APA Division 5 of Qualitative and Quantitative Methods. We've been offering these virtual salons since last year as a way to showcase innovative research, offer educational resources, and build community of qualitative researchers across the globe, especially during these hard times of the pandemic. So if you like what you see today and you're not already a member, head over to squip.org to learn how to join us officially. So we have a very special virtual salon planned for you all today, but first I want to go over some logistics. You can imagine that what you're viewing today is a performance of sorts, and your job as audience is to sit back and enjoy the show and acquire a whole lot of wisdom about qualitative methods in the process. That being said, please keep your mics muted during the entire performance and hold off on asking questions until the official Q&A portion of the event, which will be the last 10 minutes. And at that time, you can type your questions in the chat for presenters to respond to. So this session will also be recorded and posted on our website to view afterwards. And in just a few moments, I'll hand the mic over to Ruth Ellen Josselson, who's organized today's incredible virtual salon titled What's the Difference? A conversation comparing approaches to qualitative analysis. Before I do that, I just want to express my utmost gratitude to each of the experts and founders of qualitative methods who will be presenting today. We are just so lucky to have you doing this for us on behalf of the SQUIP community. And so without further ado, I'll now hand the stage over to you, Dr. Josselson.
Thank you, Nisha, and thank you for all of your work in organizing this. I'm Ruth Ellen Josselson, and I want to welcome everybody to this salon. As qualitative approaches to research have become more valued and widely used in psychology, many researchers have questions about which qualitative method would be most useful for their study. Okay, there are many qualitative methods, and we've chosen to highlight 5 of the most widely used ones in this panel. But there are others, like discourse analysis, intuitive inquiry, and the listening guide, and we have highlighted those in SQUIP's journal, Qualitative Psychology. Now, as Lisa Osbeck once so succinctly put it, all of these methods are means to take apart data and put them back together again. In order to focus on what some of the main differences are among these methods in terms of how they create, take apart, reorganize, and interpret data, we have devised an unscripted panel. The way this will work is I will introduce, or am now introducing, Leo Kerala, who is one of my doctoral students, and he will enact a student in dialogue with the presenters. Each of these presenters are either founders of or experts in 5 different methods. Leo will ask a prearranged research question and will ask the presenters in turn to advise him about how to set up the research project from the point of view of their method. The biographies of each of these experts are on the flyer and will be posted online with the recording of this salon. In the interest of time, I'm not going to repeat them here. But unfortunately, Jonathan Smith was taken ill and is unable to join us in this salon. So he has invited one of his colleagues, Michael Larkin, who is a reader in psychology at Aston University in Birmingham, UK, to substitute for him. And Michael has really joined us at the very last minute, and we're very grateful to him for doing that. The dialogues you're about to see are not scripted. They will be improvisational. Each presenter will have 20 minutes for their dialogue. This is an exceptionally short period of time. And all of the presenters are used to having day-long or multi-day long workshops on their method. But we hope that in this compressed time, we can get at the essences of each method. Following the dialogues, Lisa Osbeck will try to summarize the similarities and differences that she has noted and the panelists will also be able to comment on her summary. At the very end, we will try to have about 10 minutes for questions from those of you who are attending if you put these questions in the chat. So we're about to begin, and here are Leo Caralla and Heidi Levitt, who is an expert on critical constructivist grounded theory.
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to say I'm honored to be here to be the student representative. So thank you everybody for being here. Yeah, my question is, I want to study COVID-19 and the personal impact that it has on college students. How would you advise going about taking on an inquiry like that? How would you gather data? How would you analyze the data? How would you report that? Where do I begin? And so that's the problem.
Awesome. Awesome. So I'll begin by telling you a little bit about my approach, which is critical constructivist grounded theory. And I'm going to step back to preface that, my larger view of methods is one that's very epistemologically pluralistic. And what that means is that I think there's so many different kinds of goals and aims and activities that drive the studies that psychologists do. And so there are many different kinds of approaches that make sense. And critical constructivist grounded theory to me is one of those. This focus on critical constructivist grounded theory, or CCGT, is a little bit narrower though than some other writings that I've done, like on the JAR Journal Article Reporting Standards, which were meant for across the whole field. Here, I'm really focusing on questions that have to do specifically with critical kinds of interests. So people who are interested in studying things that have to do with things around structural power, things that have to do with agency, oppression, privilege, and also how those things work in psychology and how they affect us as researchers. Right? And also, so that's the critical part of the method and my take to grounded theory. And then also people who are interested in constructivist questions, which have to do with things around the development of meaning. How do we shape and understand what meanings are important in a different area? So here, and also how does that affect us as researchers when we're developing meaning and we're developing findings? So thinking about that in terms of COVID, probably this approach would be most appropriate when you're thinking about critical kinds of questions around things like, how did COVID affect people differently in society, right? We know that it affected people of color, it affected people from different socioeconomic classes, it affected people who are frontline workers or service workers in very different ways than other people. So what's happening on this social level? And then also, what are the meanings around what COVID represents, the meaning it takes in people's lives? And then, how do we as researchers bring ideas about that into our research? So I have these two kinds of broad set of aims, but I think that to answer any of those, there could be many, many answers. And so the first place I would begin would be to encourage you as a researcher to think about what are your specific interests. And for some researchers, they may have interests that are more critical. That may be the thing that you are super passionate about. Or it may not be. It may be that you're really interested in like the development of meaning or the way meaning is constructed in discourses around COVID. And so really it would be beginning with, if you were my student, we would want to talk, right? And maybe, a number of meetings about really refining what your interests are, so that you could select procedures within grounded theory. And I'm going to talk more about what grounded theory is in a moment, but so you could select procedures that are really coherent with your goal and mission. So before we would even decide if this is a right thing for you, we'd want to really think, what are your questions? What are your interests? What are your goals? And then think, if we were going to do something that was critical constructivist grounded theory, even within that, would there be one part that you'd be leaning on more or interested in more, right? I focusing on this combination of critical constructivists because it seems to me that often in psychology today people are very interested in that. Also, it's the areas of research that I do are very focused on that. So I'm just wanting to make clear that I'm not saying that I think other approaches aren't valid, but this approach is helpful for these kinds of interests. And grounded theory as a method has been used in many different kinds of ways and has evolved with different people putting forward different versions of grounded theories that are more realist or more constructivist or more critical. And this approach really draws from across those traditions. So we probably would want to start off by thinking about your question, what's really of interest of you, and then thinking really about your objectives. So how do you want to use the findings, right? So is what you want to have a psychotherapeutic intervention. Maybe you want to have a group for undergrad students around COVID in a counseling center. Or maybe what you want is to develop a theory, right, of reactions to experiencing loss around COVID. Or maybe what you want is to do activism, right, around people's experiences, differentially problematic hardships around COVID, right, in different groups. So we'd want to think about what is the endpoint. And all of these things would help us select, how we were going to do this. And we'd want to think about you as a researcher too. So what is your positionality? How do you identify yourself? What are the kinds of expectations you're bringing in? What are the kinds of assumptions? And so these are all issues that we would talk about in quite some depth as we are considering this kind of approach, right? Grounded theory is, so some things about grounded theory that are more specific as a method are that typically we'd want to form a question that would be that would have some depth in it. I'll talk a little bit about how grounded theory organizes data by constructing what can be a somewhat elaborate data hierarchy. And so if your question, if you don't think your question is going to develop a good deal of richness in the answer, then I wouldn't recommend a grounded theory method at all, right? So you're using this kind of approach because you think that there's going to be something and answers that are rich, that would sustain and make worthwhile developing this kind of hierarchy, and a purpose, right? So I'll talk about that too. So usually there's also one central questions, which you seem to have. So that would fit well. And also sometimes people think that grounded theory is developing just one theory of something, but grounded theory has been used, especially in psychology, to develop many different kinds of outputs. So sometimes it could be a theory or a depth of understanding, or to just shape a clinical practice, or to develop items for measures. So there can be many different kinds of things. Does that give you a little bit of a...
Yeah, that's really helpful. I already do have one question. It's okay to... Would you approach it differently? I like that you laid that out in terms of how you use the findings. Are you developing a theory? Is there activism? Would you go about the research differently if that were the case? Or
yeah, I would ask different kinds of questions, depending on what it is, right? Mm-hmm. I would ask different kinds of questions. I would expect that my analysis would have a focus that would be, I would want my findings to have utility based upon the kinds of goals that I have. It may be that I don't know what goal I have, right? That may evolve also in the study. But if I do know, then it's helpful, because then I can to be maximally useful, right? And this is especially helpful if I'm doing research that is, deliberately trying to serve a community, because then I want my research to be beneficial for that community. And I may be working with, I may be doing something participatory where I have people from that community working with me. And there may be clear goals and things that community is wanting or needing or would benefit from. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess What did you want to share more? I didn't want to interrupt at this time.
No. I could talk about data collection
Yeah,
or
that'd be great.
analysis. What do you?
That'd be great.
Okay, so in terms of data collection, often a question is, what kind of participants to seek, and how do you know when you're done data collection? And in grounded theory, usually our recommendation is to really think about, again, what your question is, and to think about trying to get a lot of diversity within the kinds of answers that you think would lead to variation in your phenomenon, right? So something that I try to think about is, how comprehensive does my answer need to be to solve this problem or to answer this question? Usually people use grounded theory because they're interested in developing a more comprehensive kind of answer. And if that's the case, then I do things like, thank you, Dylan, to look for participants who are different in ways that I think might have. So for COVID, I might try to deliberately make sure I have diversity in terms of things like race and class and type of employment. And so I think, what are the things that might affect diversity in COVID experiences? And I would seek deliberately those things. Also, as I collect my data, I'll be looking to see what kinds of themes and commonalities are coming forward, and what things aren't being answered. What questions are left open for me that I still don't understand. And this is called theoretical sampling, where I might then deliberately seek out people who could help answer those questions that are the gaps in my evolving understanding. I also think about sorry?
You might want to get to the analysis
Okay.
piece because you're just running out of time.
So in terms of analysis, let me just show you here. I'll just share this briefly. So this is an example of a segment of data that I have. I'm not going to read it, but basically this is a question, being put about someone's COVID experience. And I would be looking at that data, and in the mode of grounded theory that I use, I draw from David Rennie's practice of using meaning units, which come from phenomenology, and I would break down the piece of text into units that each seem to contain a central idea that seems meaningful and important. And so I might have different kinds of units that draw from that data. And then I would start to organize them in terms of a hierarchy. And so I might have a bunch of meaning units here on the bottom, and I would group them together based upon commonalities and differences and patterns that I see into higher order categories, which in turn would be grouped together into higher order categories. And in this way, I'm developing a more complex hierarchy system of these categories that gradually go from being very concrete in people's lived experience to being more abstract and more theoretical. And this could be helpful for me in that what I can do with my hierarchy can be quite complex in the end. So, and this is really what I think is distinctive about grounded theory, and is that there's different sorts of things that you could do because your data is organized differently. So for instance, if I wanted to develop a workshop, I might say, oh, I'm going to develop a 2-day workshop in this day. Here, I can see what are the things that are important for me to address because they flow from this central component of something that's meaningful or important. And in this day, I'm going to do this thing. Or if I'm interested in developing a measure, I might say, well, here I have all of these initial units. I can develop questions based upon these measures. I could expect that I might end up having factors that correlate, or that might be conceptually connected to categories or higher places in the cluster, higher clusters in the hierarchy. Or I might say, well, I'm going to have an advocacy. I'm going to engage in advocacy work. So I'm going to have two different charges, right, within my group, and different sorts of efforts we're going to take. And so my different categories and could help structure those efforts, because I can see, right, how they're grounded, right? And it gives me a lot of information that I can use to construct an advocacy effort and to think about what would be useful for people. So in this kind of way, I am just continually thinking about how my findings could be most useful, right? And for me, grounded theory is useful in that kind of service. So I was going to say that other things that I would do would be to include different kinds. I could include different kinds of strategies that might enhance my analysis, because I have a participatory, because I have really a critical aim. I often try to include participatory features in my analysis. I often will use strategies that were developed that might not have been developed even with a critical perspective, and I'll adapt them to make them more useful and to meet my aim. So like I might seek participant feedback, but instead of seeking it to validate my findings, I might seek it to give me feedback from different perspectives that may help me see different things in my findings. And so I could take, you know, a procedure that has been used in one way, and I can adapt it to be used in a different kind of way. And that's something that I'll commonly do within my methods. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to say. Okay. You have any other questions, Leo?
I do, but I want to take away from your time. Yeah, that last piece sounded really interesting. So were you saying, and do all these methodologies stress critical consciousness? Is that in all of them, or more are you feeling grounded theory?
They could be brought. You could bring critical consciousness to any method,
right?
Right. But the critical constructivist grounded theory, I mean, my book, and when I think about the method, the idea is I'm trying to provide guidance for how to do that within a grounded theory kind of context, which often doesn't have that sort of lens.
Mm-hmm.
So, but you could bring it to any kind of method, right? That
Yeah.
This is one way. It's a laid out kind of way of to help you think about it more. But I also ask, I ask users, right? Or I ask students, and in my book, I ask readers to think about what's relevant for them in their projects. Because I think it's really important to be mindful of what your goals are, what your aims are, and to make that decision. So it says 5 minutes, Ruth Ellen. Do I have 5 minutes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because I thought I was done. So
But Heidi,
yeah,
and it might be useful because you put up the chart of some of the findings.
yeah.
Could you be more specific about the critical constructivist part of that
Okay.
chart and how you would, just to make that
Sure. All right. I think I was going by the time being 4:25 and thinking I better stop. But okay, so I was moving quickly. So here in this chart, you can kind of get you can even get a sense of how, this is an example of a unit that's very focused on how the experience of COVID may be influenced differently by people's identities, right? And so for many people who are LGBTQ, a challenging thing is that they may have to take residence with people who are homophobic or transphobic or, aren't comfortable with their identities in many different kinds of ways. And so the experience of COVID is different, right? Because of that, that systemic kind of oppressive experience. This second one is more just about the idea of a loss of independence when I had to return to home and not be accepted as an adult, which I guess has to do with power in terms of adult versus developing emerging adult structures, but is a little bit more broad across people in that age group having to have that experience. And again, it would be different for different people. So you would be collecting more data than just in grounded theory than just one person. In the hierarchy, you'd be thinking about, how do I group things together in ways that help me understand what's happening, both in terms of the person's process of making meaning of COVID, and also in terms of their context, right? And what that context means to them in terms of their identities, in terms of the people that they have to interact with in those contexts. And so you'd be picking up and tracking those things. So here you can see that's coming up in different kind of places, right? Here, I feel more fragile, vulnerable because I don't have allies around me anymore, right? I lost all my allies because now I had to leave my university and that's where they were. So my identity is more at a risk. Here, this idea of separation from community as a loss of purpose and resilience to stigma. So I feel more vulnerable to stigma because I don't have the same supports around me. I'm more isolated generally. So these sorts of things, you're mindful in your data, and so you're looking to track those things and not lose them because you're focusing, on just the meaning for the individual person. So I don't know if that's helpful, but you're bringing that forward, and then you end up developing one sort of core category that pulls together what you think is the overarching meaning in your hierarchy. And this is why, in part, that you want to have one central question when you're doing a grounded theory study, because otherwise it would be hard to develop one hierarchy, right? It wouldn't be coherent in a way. So that becomes important. Okay, I think that something that is important in this approach is that you don't, you want your, I don't know if you can see here, but you want your findings and your category titles to not replicate your question. So there's some methods where you create categories that are, or groupings of data that are organized by the question that you're asking. And here you're not really doing that. You're organizing the data really inductively based upon what the answers are and the kinds of commonalities and patterns that you're seeing across the data. Yes.
Yeah, just reflecting back. Sorry about the dog barking. The one thing I take away as a student, I'm totally new to this style of qualitative research. I have other ones I know more, but it feels like there's a organization, a visual organization and layout piece that's really attractive and really interesting. And I really like how you kind of laid that out. Do students, will they present something like this to you as they're working with you, or?
They will. We'll spend a lot of time going through their hierarchy as it's evolving, because it's going from much more concrete experiences to typically much more theoretical kinds of ideas. And this is super awesome in that you can, again, there's just, what I like about it is I can do so many things with this hierarchy because I can see, I can not only end up with these ideas, but I see how they're grounded in the data. And I have all the steps along the way in my interpretation laid out. So it gives me a lot of confidence. So I think that I'm done now, yes?
Yes, you are. Thank you so
for bearing
much.
with
Right.
me. And thank you,
Thank you so
Leo.
much.
It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you. Bye.
You need to take off your share.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Heidi. Next, we're going to have Ginny Brown, who's going to be presenting thematic analysis. Welcome, Ginny.
Great, Ellen.
Hi, Jenny.
Hi, Leo. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well.
Do you want to, shall I just sort of jump in with a bit of a description of thematic analysis?
Yeah, that would be great. Appreciate that.
Yeah, so just for everyone who's listening, we're kind of talking around the same sort of research question and idea. And I think the first thing to know about thematic analysis is that it's not one approach. It's, like grounded theory, like Heidi was very specifically talking about a particular version of grounded theory, and there are many different versions of thematic analysis, and sometimes going by different names but doing similar sorts of things. But where it offers a tool as an approach is that it's looking at kind of ways to identify, interpret, make sense of patterned meaning across a data set. And how that patterning is captured, though, varies quite a bit across the different approaches to thematic analysis. So with my colleague in the UK, Victoria Clark, we've written quite a lot about an approach which we now talk about as reflexive thematic analysis. I'll come to why that is in a moment. But we've, over the years of writing about it, we've really started to understand how the differences across types of approaches are really, really important. So if you're doing thematic analysis, first understanding which approach you're using and why is most important. And it's important because one of the things that might seem counterintuitive is that they actually refer to or conceptualize a theme itself in quite different ways. And so Heidi kind of talked about, just talked about now right at the end about kind of clustering meaning units, I guess, around like a research question or the types of questions you might ask in data collection. And our writing around thematic analysis, we've now started to talk about those as kind of topic summaries, or where basically a whole lot of meaning that all relates to the same issue is captured together. But in our version of thematic analysis, we're interested in united idea, like a uniting idea, a uniting practice, a uniting concept. So it's the sort of same idea of meaning that is what you're looking for and what you're exploring and interpreting and making sense of. And that will come a bit clearer as we talk through the process. And the reason we call it reflexive TA is because, you know, it's become really clear that this is not a positivist or post-positivist method. This is an approach where researcher subjectivity is absolutely fundamental. So what you bring to the process as an interpreter of data is crucial in the sense-making process. And we think that valuing that as part of the process is actually important, and reflexively examining the ways in which you are engaging and shaping the data to tell the story. So it's not a sort of process that is about sort of revealing the truth that's in the data, but it's so much as a kind of making sense of it from the position that you bring as a skilled analyst to a research context, someone who is situated within multiple identities, is situated within communities, and is situated in a kind of scholarly context as well. And, you know, but when you're doing reflexive TA, you can bring a wide range of broad kind of meta-theoretical or epistemological or ontological positions to it. So you can come to it from a sort of quite critical realist or almost sort of realist approach, interested in kind of experience and experiential practices, or you can come to it from more critical or constructionist or social meaning making process perspectives. And that means that you can tackle a very wide range of research questions with the method. So you can ask questions about experience or about the sort of experiences that people might have in the world. And if you were doing a topic around COVID-19 and students, you might ask people to report their experiences to you and, you know, what has it been like? But you can also ask quite sort of practical questions of people like, you know, what are your practices? What do you do? What is your world like? You know, you could ask people to report to you on how COVID has changed their lives and in their kind of practical sense, not in you know, how they eat, how they, you know, engage with their families, how they engage with their loved ones, those sorts of questions. And you can also use it as an approach to grapple with meaning in a whole lot of different ways. So that could be from the sort of broader representational practices through to the quite sort of critical or constructionist ideas about how our truth and reality of this topic is being put together by the ways it's represented, the sort of tools that have been made available to us socially. Yeah, and so that means that you can gather a very wide range of data that might be suitable for using for a thematic analysis. So it's a bit different to some of the other methods that are going to be talked about, or the approaches that are going to be talked about, and that there's a lot of flexibility and fluidity around what might count as data and what might be useful for answering or addressing. I don't like answering. I think addressing is a better concept, addressing a research question. I've sort of said a whole lot there. Do you want to clarify or check in with anything before I jump into the next bit?
Well, I'm still just actually chewing on that last part. I really like just the way you framed that. You were saying about it, addressing it versus answering. Because I haven't heard it quite framed that way, which I really like. And if I heard correctly, were you saying it was different in the sense that there's a wider range of data that you can look at? Was that correct or no?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think, you know, within qualitative research, you know, we have a very iconic status for, you know, the in-depth interview method, and that's a wonderful method for gathering in-depth, rich information. But depending on what your research question is and your pragmatic context as well, that might not be the best approach. So, you know, we've done projects with thematic analysis using a whole lot of different methods, from kind of media data through to like a method called story completion, where people write in response to a prompt or a cue and tell a story about something, qualitative survey data. And in some of those methods, what you get is quite a lot of breadth. You know, you get a whole lot of stories, but in contrast to what people might think, they're often quite sort of nuanced and complex, and, you know, what you'd call rich data as well. But I think it's useful. I think one of the things I always encourage for my students is that question around, you know, what data could we use to answer this question? Don't just sort of fall back on you know, a qualitative interview, because that's the approach we're all many of us have been trained up in, or learnt that as the first approach, did our first studies using those sorts of data. So you've got a lot of freedom in that. I think that's a kind of key take home really for reflexive TA. There's a lot of freedom.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting to hear. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. And I think, you know, sort of I'd reiterate some of the stuff that Heidi said in relation to research questions, and that if I were, one of my first questions would always be, you know, what do you want to know, to try and kind of get at the nub of what it is about this topic that really kind of fascinates you, or you're grappling with, or you're trying to understand. And then the sort of connected part of that question is, why do you want to know this? Are you just interested in it? Are you, you know, wanting to have an outcome which might serve a particular purpose? You might want to feed into policy, you might want to feed into, you know, a strategy, you might want to, as you know, Heidi said, you might be working with a community, they might want some information for to inform social practice, social change, those sorts of things. So the broad question that you have, I think it's important to kind of get at what is it that you really want to know, because that's not disconnected from the type of data that might be best suited, or the type of data that might be good enough. And, you know, it's always a kind of a compromise between a kind of perfect data idea and a good enough data, and that has to be assessed. I think as well, where reflexive TA can be a little bit different to certainly how Heidi's kind of talked about grounded theory, is that you can start with a very broad research question, but then that might get refined and shaped and changed as the analysis progresses. And partly that might be because the actual question you address in your analysis of the data might be tackling something slightly different, or exploring an unanticipated angle of the data. So, you know, you might have a whole lot of data from students. Thanks, Ruth Ellen. And you might be surprised to see that identity is a key feature of the data. So you might shift your research focus to go, okay, I'm going to focus on identity in relation to this topic for this particular analysis. But it's possible to do more than one analysis of a thematic analysis within a thematic analysis if you've got different research questions you're addressing. I have got a screen that I can share that has some data and that kind of talks through the process of analysis. So I will just start this, and I will just comment that in thinking about this question, I thought that a type of data that might be really great would be diary data. So you ask people to keep real-time diaries in which they reflect on their experiences, and those entries may be long and involved. Diary data can be really fantastic. So I've kind of imagined a data set here where you've been asked to please keep a regular diary in which you reflect on how COVID-19 and changes in your learning environment have impacted you. We've got 4 excerpts here where students, university students, are kind of reflecting on things that sometimes relate to their study or learning, but not all. And I think it's important to note that these type of data have asked them to reflect, not just keep a diary like what did you do today, but to kind of reflect on these questions. And so with the process of thematic analysis, we would do the first sort of process is a process of familiarization, of reading the data, of starting to kind of grapple and think about, what are the curiosities in here? What are the interesting things in here? What are the things that I start to notice as I read these? The things that might surprise me, the things that I'm always kind of encourage my students and myself to go, what doesn't surprise me? Because what doesn't surprise you is also revealing and interesting. And then you, after you've done that familiarization and reflected and had some responses, then you move into a coding phase. And coding in reflexive TA is very open and organic. It's not, it's developed as you go through the data set, and there's no coding frame or something that you apply to the data so much as kind of building up a process. And so I've done some coding of this data set. And so the coding that you can do in reflexive TA can be really sort of what we would call semantic, so focusing on quite explicit content, but it can also be quite conceptual or getting at the sort of assumptions or underpinning ideas that you might be sort of starting to notice in the data set. And you can have creativity and fun. So one of the codes that I kind of came up with, I called Staying Focused in a Tornado, which kind of captures the data in the sense that people were writing in these diary entries about difficulty focusing and those sorts of things, but actually conceptualizing a kind of chaotic world that that COVID had produced for many of us. And you'll see, if you kind of go through this list, that many of these codes are individual. There's only kind of one instance of them, and then some of them are repeated. So you've got a code here which is like changed bracket sense of self, and part of the organic and openness of TA is that it allows you to sort of keep things in play, as it were. You don't have to settle into things early on. And so here I was going, is it changed self or is it changed sense of self? And which way might that go? And might that difference be useful or interesting? And who knows? So I've kind of kept things open. And then after you've done this kind of full coding process, you then go through a process of kind of theme, provisional theme development, and you do that by clustering your codes initially together. And you kind of, one of the tools that we really like is kind of visual mapping processes, where you kind of start to sort of move things around and see where ideas might sort of build into each other. And so I've started recently using Miro, which is a digital whiteboard, which is quite a lot of fun. And so what I did, and what I would do is, in starting this process, is really just kind of like start to bring all the codes together and think about how they might cluster and where some sort of shared ideas might unite a whole lot of different clusters. And I've done this in multiple colors to kind of try and capture things which I felt like, oh, these seem like they're about the same sort of idea. So a cluster over here about the impossibility of choice and staying focused and your brain not behaving normally, and those sorts of things all kind of somehow maybe connect to a different learning process, but who knows? This is all very provisional, and TA will go through multiple iterations of this kind of exploring the connections between different codes and then going back to the data and seeing how it kind of actually maps out. But what you're aiming to get to is a number of shared, multifaceted kind of themes, which are all united by a core idea, central, we call it a central organizing concept, the key kind of thing that holds all the different manifestations of the idea together, and that those kind of become the story that you're telling the data. And that's really what you're doing in reflexive TA. That's what we want to encourage people to kind of think about it as, a process of storytelling, of making sense of the data, of thinking about what is the story that needs to be told, that's important to be told, that offers new insight, that addresses the research question, that fulfills the need or the want that I have for this method, for this project, for this analysis.
5 minutes, Jenny.
Thank you. So Leo, do you have questions from that?
Yeah, I have a few. So if the slide, if you went back the one before,
Mm-hmm.
and this is a simplistic question, but are like the emojis, or are those, and the capitalizations and things like that, those are part of those aren't added, those are for effect. And is that something that gets tracked, or are all these done using technology, or are these handwritten, or?
You could do it either way. And, you know, like with diary data, people who use diary data have sometimes used, you know, handwritten diaries and sometimes use digital diaries. So I think it's about finding the right tech for people as well. And also giving people like the parameters, you know, you could, you know, some people are starting to use thematic approaches on visual data, or different versions of kind of textual data, or different kind of creative methods. And that's a really kind of exciting opening area. And I think one of your challenges, if you were looking at data like this, would be to go, how much are the emojis that might be in the data part of the interpretative content of the data? Do they match or not? And there's no kind of rule around that. It's kind of up to you to make that kind of decision, which is kind of like, you within reflexive TA, you kind of have to actively make choices, and part of the quality question is understanding why you've made those choices and what that might mean for what's included and what's excluded, and whether it matters or not.
Yeah, it strikes me because it gives sort of an emotional valence to the text, and I as simple as that is, from like a therapeutic, you know, clinical point of view, that's obviously stuff that kind of gets flagged, or it's important. So it's just interesting. How do you, in a different way of looking at this, like reaching sort of saturation, or knowing when you have enough data is like, would something like this be from, like, would you already have a lot of other data, or is this like the data that you'd use is like, okay, this is my report and I already have lots of other data, these are the ones that I'm using? Or does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we wouldn't use saturation as a concept, because it's sort of like for reflexive TA, because, and we've written a whole paper on that if people are interested, but for various reasons that I won't go into now because of time. But I think, you know, what you have to have is enough data to feel like, or to be able to kind of capture a range of meaning, a range of meaning making or experiences and those sorts of things. And we have some very sort of broad guidelines, but there's a concept that we've found quite useful, written by a Norwegian researcher, Kristi Malterud, and she talks about information power. Like, does this data set in the context of my research question and what I'm doing here, does my data set give me enough information, rich enough information, complex enough information to be able to address my research question? And so if I was doing a diary study, I might be collecting diary entries from, you know, it could be 20 participants over a 3-month period, or it could be, you know, 100 participants over a 1-week period, or something like that. So I think what thematic analysis is interested in is patterned meaning. So you have to have a data set that has breadth to it, so that you can kind of explore patterning. Although some people are using it within case study research, but that's a different question.
There's 1 minute left.
Cool.
I don't know if I can get this in, but real quick is that I came across your work in being Ruth Ellen's student. Is do I have it right? TA can be used with the others in terms of, I think it came up in our class that you could use that as almost a launching pad to do other work. Is that correct or no?
You could do it, but I think my sort of response to that would always be, why would you? Because I think in that way, unless you were going into an approach which offered something really fundamentally different, like a discursive or a conversation analysis or something like that. Sometimes that suggestion comes from the idea that there's not much interpretative depth in thematic analysis, but that only really reflects the point at which a researcher stops. Yeah. What was that, sorry?
No, I wasn't, and I was just saying that I'm not necessarily saying that. I'm just curious if that.
No, and it's an idea we come across quite a lot, and I think actually you can get a huge amount of kind of interpretative depth from TA, and it's a perfectly good method to use just on its own. But it has its limits, like any approach does.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Jenny. It's very useful, very helpful. Okay, now we're moving on to Fred Wirtz, who's going to present a way of analyzing from the point of view of phenomenology.
Okay, great. Well, hello, everybody, Leo and all. First, I'd like to tell you a bit about phenomenology because it's my understanding, and it might differ from what you've heard or what others might tell you. Then I'll turn to your research question, Leo, on the pandemic and talk about that. And then hopefully we'll have time for some questions from you, Leo, and some discussion between you and I of the presentation. The word phenomenology has a very broad reference. It applies to many ways of doing research, but they all study lived experience, consciousness, subjectivity. So that's the limit category. It includes various approaches, phenomenology I mean, such as realistic, transcendental, empirical, hermeneutic, narrative, critical, community-based or participatory, action-oriented, really, and so on and on. It can be found in the work of psychologists from different theoretical and methodological traditions, including many who don't consider themselves phenomenologists, such as Freud, James, Rogers, Kohlberg, Gilligan, and so many others. In a recent paper on phenomenological methods in research on sexuality, Frost, McClellan, Clark, and Boylan presented grounded theory, narrative, thematic, and listening guide research as examples of, guess what, phenomenology. So, well, Lisa will sort all that out for us if it's confusing. In any case, over more than 100 years, phenomenology has been explicitly employed in over 24 countries by diverse scholars. It's been used by and for marginalized people with progressive aims, including Simone de Beauvoir, Frantz Fanon, and currently Lewis Gordon, who views W.E.B. Du Bois's method in sociology as phenomenological. It's been used in liberation psychology by Mary Watkins and her students. And I've reported convergences of phenomenology with indigenous methods, especially Filipino and Native American research. Despite this ubiquity, there is one, and I dare say only one, phenomenological method. I know that may be provocative intentionally. And it was clarified, though not invented, by Edmund Husserl. It's been used in philosophy, psychology, and other disciplines, virtually every discipline that studies experience. Sociology, anthropology, theology, literary studies, and performance art. This is the method. It involves three things. One, focusing on experiences of interest, purely in their own right. Two, conceptually clarifying what these experiences are, including their meanings for the experiencer. Three, describing the findings in ordinary language. You see how broad that is. In technical terminology, these three are called, number one, the phenomenological epoche and reduction. But I want to demystify that to communicate that it involves the focus on experience. That's all that really means. Two, the intuition of essence using free imaginative variation and eidetic analysis, sometimes called the eidetic reduction, which can be demystified by saying that this is a clarification of what the experiences are. And then finally, the holistic structural description. And that is the description of the findings in ordinary language. So phenomenological methodology, and I distinguish method from methodology, and as you'll see later, from procedures of research. So phenomenological methodology, now what's methodology? That's the rationale or logic of method. And the logic and rationality of this method has also been clarified by Edmund Husserl and other phenomenological philosophers, because methodology is sort of philosophical. It's really about logic, it's about rationality, it's about normativity of knowing, really. And so although this methodology may be helpful, you don't have to endorse the methodology or even clearly understand phenomenological methodology in order to use the method. As I mentioned before, many people have used the method without ever studying the methodology that's been developed by philosophers. And so in my investigations, which I've been doing since 1980, including one with colleagues who compared 5 kinds of qualitative analysis: grounded theory, discourse analysis, narrative inquiry, and intuitive research. The phenomenological method that I mentioned above was found in all qualitative psychological research. Even though it is often informally practiced and not acknowledged, nor is the methodology necessarily known by these researchers. In practice, then, the phenomenological method can be done rigorously and thoroughly, or it can be done haphazardly and partially. But it's important to know that phenomenology is method. It's these 3 things. It's not a dogma. It's not a theory. It is itself theoretically neutral, atheoretical, and it can be therefore used to verify, criticize, guide, or extend psychological theorizing, or have nothing to do with theory. Many procedures that are used in phenomenological research are compatible and can be used with the phenomenological method and methodology. A lot of procedures can be considered or used phenomenologically. Starting in the 1970s, Georgi formalized and scientifically justified specific procedures for phenomenological protocol analysis in the human sciences. And since then, others have added to this body of work, including books by Van Manen, Moustakis, Smith, since the 1990s, and most recently, Scott Churchill in the current APA lineup of books on qualitative method. The phenomenological method can be used with many topics, virtually any subject matter that includes experience. And with many different procedures, I mean different research designs, different participants, data collection, analysis, forms of reporting. Although a vast array of procedures can be integrated with phenomenological method, I don't believe that any of these procedures is required or necessary. Phenomenological researchers are really free to draw on all traditions, combine them, and create new ones. Decisions about what procedures are to be used are based on the research topic, the questions, goals, and the investigator's preferences and innovations. One can proceed with one's own or others' experience, engage in any kind and number of participants, collect written descriptions, interviews, observations, or archival materials of so many sorts, analyze the data with dozens of strategies, and communicate findings in many different ways, ranging from a scholarly report that includes a hierarchy, flowcharts, narrative, constituent themes, whatever best expresses the psychological structure as a whole. And it has also been culminated in action projects and theater performances. So it's not necessarily a method that results in scholarly reports. The impact of COVID on college students is a very broad topic because there are so many different examples in which this topic could be studied. The question, what is the impact of COVID? General one requiring thought. That is the researcher's question. It sounds almost like a causal question that might be asked by an experimental psychologist. How does X affect Y? Where X, COVID, is physical and Y is psychological. Presumably, that's what we're doing, not just physical effects of college students. But in any case, phenomenology does not study the former, the pandemic, the physical, but only the latter, provided that it's conceived as personal, experiential. So one gathers concrete examples of lived experiences relevant to, quote, the impact of COVID, as it were. Revealing experiences could include taking a remote class, watching a news report about COVID, imagining oneself being rushed to a hospital and put on a respirator, driving past a farm with signs saying, "Unmask our children," "Impeach Governor Whitmer," or listening to one's doctor explain how the vaccine works, or a neighbor who once told me he would not wear a mask because it's illegal to wear a mask while carrying a gun or buying a mask. One could be interested in studying the full diversity or of these experiences, or more specific subtopics in a kind of universe of examples of the subject matter. One could study one's own experience or others, and could focus on one person or many. One could strive for very high or very low levels of generalizability, and one could have theoretical or practical goals. Like other qualitative approaches, phenomenology emphasizes reflexivity, self-criticism, and social accountability on the part of the researcher. The researcher's social position and preconceptions of the subject matter are sometimes identified and described, but most importantly, they are always put aside. That's the first step of phenomenological method. Focusing on the examples of the experience rather than on any kind of philosophical dogma or prior scientific work on the topic or personal research hunches or common opinions. All these things are what is called bracketed, put aside. And that means only that they're put aside. One directs one's attention elsewhere. They don't go away, but they are not the focus of attention in this research, which is freely and exclusively on the concrete examples of experience under investigation. Now, asking participants to answer the researcher's question directly may elicit participants' current thinking about the topic, an artifact of the research situation, rather than descriptions of concrete examples of experience in the participant's life world, which is the basis of phenomenological research. So what Ruth Ellen Joss calls the big Q, researcher's question, must be translated into a little q for participants in order to invite participants to describe thickly concrete examples of their world experience. So some little q questions might be, describe a specific situation in which you were affected by the pandemic, or describe a situation in your life related to the pandemic, or using Flanagan's critical incident technique, describe two situations. First, one in which you were effective dealing, and then one where you were unsuccessful dealing with the pandemic. Or story of your experiences during the pandemic, starting with your life before COVID, and walking me through that your whole experience of the pandemic right to the present. Now, the main point of all these questions is to get faithful, detailed, thick descriptions of lived experiences as they occurred in their original time, not general thoughts about the topic or even later thoughts about the sample of experience that's being described. So
Fred, you have, okay, are you going to analysis now?
Yep. Well, let me get my screen up here. Okay. Share screen. All righty. Here we go. Okay. So here's a brief description of my own, actually. The pandemic has been dreary, isolating, and politically disturbing. After a year and a half in Michigan, I returned to New York City, where I lived before the pandemic, for the first time to visit my daughter. I'd worried about her, missed seeing her. Walking to her apartment, I was surprised by the uplifted by all the restaurants with outdoor dining and everyone wearing masks, Black, white, young, old, families, all so happy, natural, and committed. So different from Michigan, where I've seen people protest masks, carry guns instead, and fear their loss of freedom. They are scary, confusing, but also intriguing and proud the way they live. I saw a Mexican store. I love Mexico and had worried about my friends there. There was a table of beautiful masks outside. I liked one with an embroidered skull and little heart, love. It's my favorite mask, but sometimes I have to wear it, another one under it for extra protection. It shows impending death, my own and others, the festive way Mexicans celebrate the dead, and that masks are a worldwide response to the pandemic. My friends in Mexico have said that I have a Mexican soul and heart. People comment on that mask, and I've talked with them many times about the spirit of Mexico and also New York City, where I got it, and how great that spirit is. So I will go now to the analytic procedures, which I'll draw from Georgie, read the description openly to understand its meaning as a whole, demarcate meaning units, segments of data that can be analyzed as a whole, reflect on each meaning unit to grasp what it reveals about the psychological life in regard to the topic, how it answers the research question, and then finally, 4, synthesize all reflections in a holistic structural description of the psychological findings. So I want to say a little bit about Georgie, and this method, because I believe that it's logical, scientific, normative, and that it actually takes place in many, I would argue, every qualitative research method, even though it may not be formally acknowledged or followed in steps like this, but it has the virtue of accounting for all the data and tracing from the data to the findings in a way that shows how all data can be accounted for. So let me go to, this is just a beginning of a synthesis, a very brief sample of like a synthesis of my own reflections. And we can go back to this if you want and look at these different meaning units and what kind of reflections might be possible with them. But this I call as a whole the bittersweetness of the pandemic. The pandemic is experienced.
Fred, you have 3 minutes.
The pandemic is experienced as an extreme threat, including death to self and others, dreary and isolating. The goal is to live closely with others, to reunite with family, and to protect life from harm and demise, together with those who blend practicality, festivity, and love. Cultivating these cherished shared values enhances identity by positioning self with those who acknowledge deadly danger, protect life, honor the dead, and thrive in the face of global sickness, separation, and isolation. Experiences animated by a desire for connection, love, solidarity, and flourishing in a community that protects and celebrates life. Maybe I'll end there and let Leo ask some questions. and have a little discussion.
Thanks, Fred. That was really great. Actually, the one thing is, it's more, I think I'm reflecting it back, and I think I've read this in your work before, but if I understood it correctly, you're saying you don't really need to understand Husserl or Heidegger or that to be able to do phenomenological research. It's great if you did, but the methods, is that right?
Yeah, great question, Leo. And that's exactly what I said. And, you know, it's interesting. I have a dialogue going with a phenomenological philosopher who sort of thinks that it's important to understand that. And I don't think it is, although, as you mentioned, I think it may be very helpful to do it. But I remember David Rennie, who was one of the great Canadian psychologists, pioneered grounded theory. He initially was going to use phenomenology, but people told him it would take him 10 years to understand Husserl. So that was why he chose grounded theory for his qualitative research. I thought that is not necessary, because I've found great phenomenological research done by researchers who have no knowledge of Husserl or methodology. They haven't read that library's worth of literature. However, like my philosopher friend wants to distinguish faint-hearted from wholehearted phenomenology. And as I've mentioned, it can be done well or worse, haphazardly or thoroughly. It can be done with self-understanding or not. And those things can help a lot. The philosopher was worried about his own possible elitism. And I'm too. And I think phenomenology is something that can be shared. Anybody interested in experience who has any knowledge of it is using phenomenological methods. The question is,
you have 1 minute.
So that's I mean, that's the answer. So it's a resource, but not a requirement.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting point. I think my own opinion, not that it matters on this, is I know as a graduate student, it felt like the buy-in maybe for some of the qualitative method is higher when you're thinking, oh, there's hundreds of years of thinking behind this. This isn't a trend, and it's of course really hard to understand unless you're.
That's right.
I've tried,
and that's one of the reasons why I love all that literature. I've been fortunate to have decades of education in it, and so in my writing, I really try to make it accessible to ordinary psychologists, and that's why I mentioned about sort of translating these technical comments into demystified terms. That's really important. And yet also to teach that literature and introduce it to people, I try to do that too, so that they understand what these terms mean.
Okay, we're out of time. Thank you very much, Fred. Okay, so now we're going to turn to Michael Larkin, who's going to respond from the point of view of interpretive phenomenological analysis.
Okay. Do I need to? I've swapped. There I am. Yeah. Okay. Leo, how would you like us to start?
Hi, Michael. Actually, if I just pose the question only because you're following the last presentation, is there? I don't want to skew if you have a whole thing you want to go into, but just even maybe, is there differences between the phenomenology that in IPA and what was just shared? Are there differences? Excuse me. Oh, you're muted, I think. There we go.
Sorry about that. Fred's given a really lovely, inclusive and pluralistic view of what the kind of big tent of phenomenology involves. And I think that's really great. I would see IPA sitting within that tent as kind of one way of implementing those ideas, drawing on those resources. I agree with almost everything that Fred said. I suppose where we differ from some other phenomenological approaches would be in the specificity of focus and in some of the particular resources that we take from that very rich phenomenological tradition. And in terms of the other talks that we've followed, I think There's obviously a shared commitment to meaning making, to understanding how people make sense of their experiences, and to an inductive approach to analysis. Beyond that, so things that maybe stand out as distinctive, IPA draws particularly on the sort of second wave of phenomenological ideas that are associated with Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty. So it's got more of an explicit commitment to seeing phenomenological work as inevitably interpretive. It can't be anything else. Than it is perhaps the case in some of the more stridently Husserlian versions. And what that means is that we tend to emphasize context very heavily in the way that we think about sampling and the way that we think about interpretation. And we tend to have an ideographic commitment to thinking about the particular as a way of managing the complexity that arises once you are committed to thinking about context. So I think there's lots of phenomenological work in the psychological tradition that is focused on trying to draw out an essential structure, something that doesn't vary across contexts. Whereas in IPA, often what we're interested in is how do people make sense of their experiences in a particular context? And so that often means that we might be trying to sample relatively deeply from a smaller pool, if you like, and to be more specific about the focus of our interest. So if a student did come to see me and said, well, I'm interested in students' experiences of COVID, probably the first conversation we'd have would be about how that focus is too broad for an IPA study. We'd be thinking, how might we narrow that down? You know, are there particular groups of students or particular aspects of the student experience that we might focus in on? So how do people feel about the rollout of vaccines in this context? Or what do students who have social anxiety already feel about the return to campus as we move in and out of these different modes of learning? So we might be specifying a particular population or a particular topic. And then we would be looking at relatively small sample sizes in IPA. As with some other methods we talked about today, we would be considering interviews, certainly as a common method of data collection, but increasingly in IPA research, we supplement those with other creative methods. So there's lots of work going around at the moment that involves the generation and interpretation of visual materials as part of the interview, for example. I love the use of diaries. I think that's a great method if you've got a population who are interested in and can be motivated to write diaries. I've been involved in a couple of projects where we've looked at people who write blogs, and we've asked them about what they write, how they write, and then also included some analysis of what they've written. So I think there's a range of different data sources that can be used in and around interviews, but very often we're interested in getting hold of a rich and detailed description of something, and then gradually moving through the interview process towards prompting some reflections on that. And in the background to all of that, I think there's an idea about what experience is. So I think experience is a shorthand in IPA terms for something that's technically probably owes a lot to the idea of orientation or our relationship to aspects of different phenomena, which is a key idea in phenomenological thinking. So what we're really interested in is what is a person's relationship to the things that matter to them in their world. And sometimes we might want to specify which part of that lived world or which things in that world we want to understand the relationship to. But the interpretations that we produce are about trying to capture those relationships. So a good theme title as an outcome is telling you something about a person's relationship to something that matters to them.
Sorry, I'm writing that. That seems really important. Wait, just to reflect that back. So the people be interested in people's experience, relationship to the things that matter to them in their living world. Yeah.
Yeah.
And one more question, just because you mentioned there too, you said small sample sizes. Would you mind saying like how small you might come across, or?
I think it probably depends a lot on the purpose and context of the research. So if you were unburdened by concern about where you might publish it, then sometimes an N of 1 or an N of 3 can make for a really good piece of IPA work. And if you ask IPA researchers what are their favorite papers, they will often pick case studies. They'll often pick out Virginia Etoff's papers on anger, for example, as really lovely examples of what the best IPA work can look like. But in practical terms, you know, if you're publishing in a health journal or a mental health journal, as I often do, I'm often looking at 10 to 15 cases, or sometimes I might reduce the number of cases, but add a bit of complexity to the design. So I might interview parents and children about their experiences of receiving a therapy, for example, and then I might have 6 of each. And I might think about the phenomenon from those 2 different perspectives in the way that I draw the analysis out. But I think that's relatively small.
Yeah, that is. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean,
let me get in here. This may be a difficult question, Michael, but you just saw Fred put up a sample of an experience and then an interpretation of it. Was that something like what you think you'd find with IPA?
Well, I can show you some example data. Would you like me to do that?
Yeah, sure. Okay.
So while the first 2 speakers were on, I was also fishing around on my computer, trying to construct something. So
okay, we're at the 10-minute mark.
Okay, that's fine. So this is COVID relevant. It's some nuts and bolts from a piece of work that's in press in a vaccine and immunology journal. I forget the title of the journal. It's a project that I worked on, and the first author on it is Poppy Brown. So this is an example of the early stage work, and I would be trying to do 2 things after an initial pass through, where I would just give myself permission to be wrong, and where the main job for me would be reflection and noticing what preconceptions and reactions I have in relation to the data, and then trying to manage the effects of those. So not full on bracketing, but rather a sense of seeing, I guess from an IPA point of view, seeing that perfect bracketing is probably impossible, but trying to notice the things that we would want to bracket and manage the influence of those as best we can. And then I would be doing this. So the first order coding is really about identifying the things that matter to the participant, things that are in their life world, and the relationship that they have to those things. So nice, neat example here. My family is a thing, it's an important part of the person's life world. And the meaning associated with it here is that we're split. You know, half of them don't believe in COVID-19, half of them do. And there's a sense that, even in this short extract here, that the participant sees themselves in the other half. You know, there's them and they're doing what they want. And the other thing I would be trying to do alongside that is to draw out experiential statements. And so these are the building blocks that themes get made from. They're a kind of interim layer interpretation where you're trying to produce a reasonably clear and crystallizing statement about the work that you're doing alongside it. So it's difficult when people are divided about what's happening, was my first go at this. But then I got a bit further down. The interviewer asks a rather leading question. It's not the best question, but these things happen. So that must feel a bit confusing, the interviewer says. Participant says, yeah, it's really confusing and really annoying, and then gives a good example of how it's annoying. So I've decided that annoying is probably a better way of thinking about what's difficult about this division. It's annoying because I don't have anybody in my house at all. but my auntie keeps ringing me all the time and she wants to come round with all of her friends and it's causing rows. She's thinking that I'm conflicting with her. And I'm saying, you don't understand, we're in the middle of a pandemic, we can't have anyone round. So drawing out this sense of dispute and conflict and what that's about, different views of what's safe and what's not, and trying to capture that in these sorts of working statements. And then the next stage would be really to consolidate those. So I would start to draw together little mini summaries of the material around those kinds of experiential statements. There's some examples of those here. And so this is still staying as close as I can to the data, but thinking as much as I can about the context and meaning of the participants' concerns and the things that matter to them. And then I would be trying to use those to think about themes. And at the case level, often I have quite loose placeholder type theme titles. I think I'm probably not going to end up with those titles once I get to the cross case level. But they're sort of, they do an important job in helping me to capture my thinking about what's in the data. So there's 3 example categories here, and in the highlight bits, you can see the experiential statements from the previous page. So you can see they're not all ending up in the same place. So we've got one which is feeling worried about the future, one which is to do with feeling hopeful about getting back to normal, and one which is to do with actually worrying about the speed of the vaccine development. Although they want the vaccine to be safe and effective, they're also worried about whether it's been produced too quickly. And so in then trying to work across multiple documents, so I would have one of those documents for each case, I would either cut and paste on a computer or put them in a spreadsheet, or sometimes I just like to print them out and work with scissors and paper and shuffle things around, try different kinds of connections, different kinds of annotations, move back and forth to the data to test out ideas in order to come up with a good theme title that captures the shared concern within the data, but also gives me space to talk about individual variation. So the beauty of these small sample sizes is that if you've got a person for whom your theme doesn't quite fit, you've got space and time to say, actually, there's something really interesting about this case. For them, the context was different. It didn't support the idea that the vaccine was a source of hope. It was terrifying and frightening. They'd had a difficult experience with medical interventions in the past, and they felt hopeless, so you can draw that out. And so then, you end up with this is a little extract from the finished write-up. You end up with a theme like, the speed is hard to explain and accept as safe, which is engaging with the data to present a view. It's a view from a particular perspective, the researcher's perspective. It's saying, if you stand over here and look at the data the way that I see it, this is a plausible and interesting way of learning from the participants' experience about what matters to them and what meaning they take from it. So I think in some ways, there's lots of common ground there with what Fred was talking about. In other ways, it's producing more of a thematic account and less of a synthetic one, in that that there is a phenomenological tradition that produces descriptions of essential features or structures or a common kind of integrated underpinning, and the IPA doesn't do that. It's moving towards thinking about, I guess, people's relationship to the things that matter to them, and where those are shared and where they're distinct.
You have 2 minutes, Michael.
Okay, so back to Leo. What would be useful for me to follow up?
Well, that actually was really helpful going through it, because there's a sense to me where you capture, I guess the words come out like a life world. You're going into that space, and like you said, their relationship to the things that are happening in their lives. And I think that's really hard to capture more than we think. It feels. Is it fair to say there's just a great deal of depth in IPA work, or?
I think that's fair. I was in supervision with a doctoral student last week who's been doing a mixed qualitative methods PhD. And so she's done some really lovely discourse and analysis work. And she's now doing a longitudinal IPA study. And she was saying, I had not anticipated how much time I would spend thinking about these data. And I think that's precisely because of the point you've drawn out there, Leo, that one of the things that makes it look easy to begin with is that some of those meanings are given to you straightforwardly by the participants. They'll give you an emotion word or an evaluation word, and you can, as in my tidied up example, you can draw that out reasonably straightforwardly. But in other places, they'll tell you a story, and you will have to think carefully about what is the tone of this story? What is the reader supposed to take away from it? What's it telling me about what's important to the participant here? And that takes much more time, and so you're moving across a range of different layers of analysis in order to draw this out.
Yeah, thank you for sharing the example. It's really helpful. Yeah, are there a lot of IPA studies looking at COVID right now? Is that happening, or?
I've been involved in a couple around vaccine hesitancy. It's a very popular topic with students. I work on an MSc health psychology program, and very often students are interested in these things. So this morning I was reading an ethics application from one of our students who's interested in the experiences of healthcare staff from Black and minority communities in the UK. I don't know if it's the same elsewhere, but here those communities were hit much harder by the first waves of COVID. All kinds of pretty terrible things came out about structural inequalities and the effect on them in terms of access to PPE and shifts that they were asked to cover and so on. And so I think that, that's a really interesting specific experience that we can focus in on. How do people feel about that period and about how they're working now? So I think there's loads of nice places where you can drill down with an IPA type design and draw things out in relation to this very big phenomenon.
Michael, thank you so much. And thank you for pinch hitting. I really appreciate it. We're out of time now. Okay, then we have Phil Hammack, who is going to speak from the point of view of narrative research.
Thanks, Rosella. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Leo. It's great to be here. This is such an important type of session in terms of distinguishing across different approaches. And as I've listened to everyone, I just think it's worth recognizing, especially for students out there and those who might be newer to qualitative methods, there is no one right method. Even if you think you have a kind of specific question or general topic area, because we heard folks kind of take Leo's question and kind of rearrange it a little bit. You can always kind of rearrange the question a little bit depending on what method you want to do. And I have to say that I think that what often draws people to some of these, the nuances are really what draw people to these different methods. Like, what are just the little nuanced ways, even that difference between Fred's approach and Michael's approach, just the little nuances perhaps of what's different. And that's totally legitimate. I mean, that because all of these are legitimate methods in their own right, and all of them are gaining even more in legitimacy over time. I think we're really seeing that. So anyway, Leo, do you want me to jump in?
No, I really appreciate you saying that. That was really helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think what occurs to me that's very, very distinctive about narrative analysis in contrast to these other methods is one very specific thing, which is that we seek to retain the person as the focal unit of analysis throughout every stage of the analysis. So I will certainly definitely illustrate what that looks like. I have a couple slides intended to do that, but maybe I'll just take a little bit of a step back and just, say that narrative analysis is a method that typically involves longer form narrative data, usually one-on-one interviews. So it wouldn't be something that you'd want to do with say, an open-ended survey question. That's just not enough data, because again, the focal unit of analysis, we really try to keep it at the level of the person throughout the analysis and the write-up. The person, and then when we aggregate to groups of people or types of people. And so again, I'll give an example of what that looks like. So, so a narrative analysis would answer how type, questions about how, questions that focus on meaning making processes or lived experience of persons are really intended to be addressed through narrative analysis. So we avoid aggregating data in a way that might obscure the person. So for example, to the theme, we do use thematic analysis or a version of it within narrative analysis, but we wouldn't then present, the findings by theme. We'd still present them by persons or types of persons. So I'll show that in a second. But so for example, with this general topic that Leo, that you brought to us about the impact of COVID-19. I think actually, when I think about your question, the big Q, and thanks Fred for kind of throwing in the big Q, little Q, we definitely think about that in narrative analysis very prominently. I think the big Q would actually zoom out and would be something more like, how does a sudden rupture in human social life, like that might occur in a war or a pandemic, impact an individual or groups of individuals, and I think that would actually be the larger question, because it would link us to a broader academic literature and a broader theoretical literature. Narrative analysis tends to be an approach that is very theoretically oriented and wanting to contribute to theory building in that sense. And so I would probably frame my big Q more like that, and then the little Q, or the more experience in your question, would probably be something like, in my lab, we study sexual and gender diversity and relationships. So I have a project going on right now that is about how COVID-19 changed the way in which people experience their romantic relationships. So something like, tell me the story about how COVID-19 impacted your relationships. And that's actually the sample piece of data I'll have up in a minute. But the tell me a story part is important, because we're trying to get at narrative meaning making, how individuals make meaning through storytelling, make meaning of their experience. So we would want to phrase the little Q in a way that's going to elicit that. And typically, just procedurally, for those who aren't too familiar with narrative interviewing, that would be the lead question in the interview. With the participant, we would jump in. If you want to do some preliminary rapport building questions, sometimes we do that. Like actually, for example, in that kind of this kind of project, I might do a preliminary rapport building question that has to do with kind of relationships in general. Like tell me about the 2 or 3 most significant romantic relationships you've had in your life, and then that's a good way to kind of get them thinking about relationships in general and their history of relationships, and then break into the little Q with the interview. And it's important to note that in this narrative interviewing studies or studies that use narrative analysis, we're not doing a rigid interview protocol. I mean, that's not the idea. That standardization is not a goal. I don't want to get too much into epistemology, but this is not a positivist or post-positivist epistemology. It's interpretive, so it's focused on meaning making and experience. The interview itself can, apart from that kind of launching question, can be more organic, and really should be, in order to develop, in order to have real authentic access, I think, to the meaning making process. You want that to be as conversational as possible. Should I say anything about like participants and sampling, that sort of thing, Leo? What do you think?
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. So, a lot of times people ask, well, for any qualitative method, there's often, because most psychologists first get trained in a more positivist or post-positivist epistemology, they are immediately kind of concerned about how many participants I should have, and when they throw out the number, a lot of my students will say, well, I think I should have probably at least 30 participants, and I'm like, well, that's a lot. That is a lot of interviews for a narrative analysis study. So that's just something to keep in mind. And I think that'll become clear when I talk about the analysis procedure and the amount of labor that's involved. So, since the goal is really not to produce some kind of universal generalizable knowledge, but rather a kind of thick description of individual psychological process, there's a lot of flexibility around sampling. In my case, because I study sexual and gender diversity, I might be thinking, and I am thinking, about sampling around diversity. So that question about relationships, I'll want to make sure includes both what we think of as like normative heterosexual relationships or different sex relationships, as well as same gender relationships, as well as monogamous and polyamorous relationships. Like in my lab, we want to sample around those different dimensions of diversity. And then within that, we might use saturation as a criteria. So, when you sort of stop hearing novel information within an interview, within a set of interviews. But I really like Ginny's, I forget what it was called, information. I have to get that from her later, because I think that's also totally a legitimate way of thinking about it. It doesn't have to be saturation. It can be like this sense that I have enough data to tell a story about a particular group of people, because I'm not trying to generalize to everyone who's ever been in a relationship ever. That's really not the point. So yeah, that's what I would say about participants. Again, like, we're not looking for representativeness. It's really not possible. It's really about capturing experience and then sort of a range of experience within a group. So there's really no magic number, as I said, so I guess that's all I'll say about participants, I guess. I don't know, Leo, did you have any questions about anything I've said before I dive into the data?
So am I, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but like when you say understood, there's something theory there in terms of like the big Q. I really liked your example. So like, if you're talking about relationships, ideas about gender, polyamory, or what is a relationship is something that has to be kind of addressed. There's a theoretical implication in the way that you're choosing people and the way that you're
exactly
right. Okay,
yeah, absolutely, for sure. Yeah.
Does that ever pose? I mean, maybe that's more specific to your own work, but does that pose challenges in terms of the interpretation? Is that done collaboratively or individually, or?
You mean the interviews themselves, or the process?
Actually, I guess more I am thinking with analysis, and I know there is some of that, right, with the narrative analysis of
go ahead. Sorry.
No. Well, but I was wondering, even on that first piece, when in the I guess maybe I'm sorry, I'm not saying the question well. Is it collaborative? Is collaboration helpful from start to finish, or at certain points, or in your opinion, or only in certain cases, or?
Thanks for telling us the 10 minutes.
No,
I think that collaboration, I think by which you mean like kind of maybe working in a team context with regard to a project, is not necessary in narrative analysis.
Okay.
As long as again, we're engaging in significant reflexive practices, which I'll highlight in a second, when I talk about all the memo writing that we do. So, and in the write-up of the report as well, significant reflexive practices. So I would, of course, want to do that with regard to all my various identities and my own history of relationships when I talk about this. Having said that, collaboration can be useful and beneficial in some ways, depending on the project. Like, for example, for sampling for diversity within, it's really helpful to have different eyes on the data, like myself holding a number of privileged identities, like, for example, being a cisgender white male, although I'm not heterosexual, that it'd still be beneficial to have, to capture the full range of experience, to have, collaborators who are perhaps people of color, women, non-binary folks. If you're really looking at that range, I think that can be a real value to the process. But just in the interest of time, should I dive into?
Yeah, that was great. I really appreciate you adding that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just share like an example piece of data, which is Luke's story with this kind of prompt. In which he said, so this is an example of the kind of response that one would get from the type of question that we're posing. Luke says, I'm the kind of person who rolls with the punches, and I don't sit around and wait for stuff to happen. I make it happen. So when the pandemic hit, I had a regular girlfriend and we were both pretty independent, not traditional and moving toward marriage and stuff. We were open. And I had even explored a bit with other guys, just little things, but I always thought of myself as straight. Well, when I was younger, I actually thought I might be bi, but then I realized right away, if you say to girls you're bi, you're fucked because they're going to think you're really gay or something. When I was growing up, everybody said girls can be bi, but guys are really just gay, straight, or lying. It kind of stressed me out, but I just held it all in. So anyway, when the pandemic hit, my girlfriend and I broke up within a month or so. She actually lost her shit and got really needy, and it wasn't for me anymore. So I spent the whole lockdown, months and months, alone with myself, and I just explored more online and realized there's a whole big community of bi guys out there. And now I feel like, okay, I can officially come out as bi. I had to do it to take this chance because who knows what would happen if I didn't. It's weird to say it, but the pandemic has been a good thing for me in some ways. So there's a lot going on here, obviously, with this story, and what do we do with it? How do we analyze it? So in narrative analysis, we talk about doing multiple readings, and in specifically, I'll go through each one. The first reading, and this is extremely labor intensive, I do want to say that, but extremely rewarding at the end of the day, because you get to know an individual person so incredibly well. So in the first reading of the entire transcript, that was just a teeny little excerpt, right? This is like a 3-hour-long interview. You would first identify the initial thematic content, which is kind of like thematic analysis light in the sense of like super inductive, just what's coming at you, and the gestalt, or what we would think of as the overall configuration or structure. Now, in this reading, you'd be listening to the audio as you read the transcript. That's important to pick up on things that that might be nonverbal, for example. You'd be annotating the transcript with your initial ideas, and you'd write a comprehensive memo several pages afterwards that actually lists all of this potential initial thematic content. The preliminary sense of the gestalt or the form or configuration, and a section on reflexivity. So in the red here is the example of what the outcome, some of the outcomes were for this particular fabricated narrative. This is a fabricated case, by the way. I should have said that from the beginning. This kind of general sense of identity exploration or discovery, a growth and adaptation mindset we see in Luke, and a generally progressive or redemptive form of his narrative. Challenges are sort of redeemed by positive outlooks. So at this point, we're mainly flagging thematic content, but we're not getting into developing, big themes within the person. The second reading involves a reading for voices, discourses, and master narratives with which the text is in dialogue. So this is almost akin to some forms of discourse analysis. And here we're really sensitized to like, what are the voices? This is also influenced by Bakhtin, Vygotsky, those kinds of philosophers and theorists. What kinds of voices from outside does Luke seem to be engaging with? Binary thinking about gender and sexuality, compulsive views around masculinity, perhaps. And this is another, this takes several hours, right? And you're doing a memo, just like with the first reading, you're doing a memo afterwards, you're listing all the potential voices. It could also be people like Luke's father or mother or brother or sister, anything like that. That kind of comes out, voices of people or institutions, for example. So that's the second reading of the single. We're talking
Phil, you're down to 3 minutes.
Okay, I'll be really quick then and say that the third reading is about identifying patterns and unity in the narrative. This is where we do more thematic analysis that's like, refining what we found in the first phase, right? And so those are some examples with Luke. Then in the fourth reading, we're bringing in theory. So this is not an atheoretical approach. It's a very theoretical approach. So in Luke's case, theories like the life course narrative theory, minority stress theory, life story theory, we'd be bringing it in, we'd be memoing and writing about it. And then the fifth and final reading is about situating this narrative in relation to others in the study. And then what we might do is create, a spreadsheet where we organize different types of people in relation to the question. So here I've given the example of the opportunity seekers, the strugglers, the foreclosures, and the radical breakers. So these are different types or groups of people. And when we write up the report, we would probably write up the results section in terms of those groups or those types of people, just to give you an example. That's a ton of information, I know, and not very much time. So I'll stop there, Leo, and just see if you have questions.
Well, I do. No, this is really great, and this is a little bit again, like there's certain styles I have a little more familiarity with and not, but yeah, I want to reflect back actually from some personal experiences how time consuming this process can be, and yeah, I was going to ask you because it is time consuming, and maybe I'm staying on that piece about theory. Is does this, like with your lab, is this something that's like ongoing? So then you kind of build this, and then it's useful to keep gathering more data later because you've already kind of set up a little bit of this, or is this sort of case by case? Does that
I
sort of
think
make
it's case by case. I will
Yep.
say that, most of my students are kind of afraid to do this and actually use thematic analysis probably the most often. And I totally support that, but I tend to mostly use this method, and and I'm increasingly trying to. And I think the book that Ruth Ellen and I did for the APA series, which I don't know if you can see it there. Oh no, it's going to block it out. But anyway, the essentials of narrative analysis is really intended to demystify some of this for students, because I think that it really seems overwhelming. We have tables and like all kinds of stuff where we really try to show how it can be done. And yes, it's very time consuming, but like I said, I think it's really worth it in terms of the depth that you really get to know these people. I mean, I went into psychology for that reason. That's why this method really gravitated to me. I began my training in clinical psychology and ended up switching to human development, but and cultural psychology. But for me, the person and wanting to know the person in depth has always been just so important and so enriching. And that's why I've kind of focused on narrative analysis as my primary method.
Phil, you have 30 seconds, and there is a question about how you then aggregate.
Yeah, so you aggregate to the person. So for example, because you've created tables along the way for each person that list all the different themes, for example, you can then create additional tables where you can see, oh, there's a whole group for whom these themes are the most frequent, and there's a whole group for whom these other themes are the most frequent. You aggregate to upward sort of to the person. I don't have a good graphic of that, but there's no set perfect way to do that. But
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you so much, Phil. I've tried to hold the time boundaries firmly, but we're over time. And so we want to have time for the discussion and for questions. So Lisa, the question is now for you. What are the differences?
Oh, do I have time to do these? First of all, we're close to the end, but
No, we'll have 10 minutes. You can still take the 10 minutes. Go ahead.
okay, sure. So I decided it's impossible within even 10 minutes to, exhaustively catalog all the differences. So I wanted to just give out some dimensions of comparison, and I'll share those with you, and then hopefully that will lead to further discussion. But I really feel like we need another couple of hours, right, just for the discussion, and to have presenters comment on things. So let me see if I can just share my screen here. This is just an outline. I was going to put this in the chat, and I still can, but this is just, to help you follow along with what I'm going to be saying here. First of all, just thank you, of course, Ruth Ellen, Nisha, Leo, and all the presenters. Really wonderful talks. Really enjoyed it and got a lot from it. I want to start really with what are just some preliminary points that I think are obvious, should be obvious to everyone, but I think they're probably important to make explicit. And the first is we really got a clear sense in this of how each of the presenters pointed out that their own method lends itself to a wide variety of approaches. There's great flexibility in terms of questions posed, form of data collected in most cases, and analytic strategies. And that was great. And these variations are really helpful for identifying the areas of overlap or similarity, but they make the task of discerning meaningful differences much more challenging. So I think it's something I'm going to use Fred's term bracket for the time being and come back to that. Secondly, presenters are persons. This is again obvious, but the significance of this is important. And as such, although we take them for our purposes to represent these different methodological traditions, they also bring a particular take on these traditions, even if they are in some kind of an originating position in relation to the tradition, but their own stamp, their own human twist, as William James called it, inflects the most systematic of procedures. So for me, it's difficult to tease out to what extent the differences or similarities, for that matter, reflect the methodological tradition per se, and how much are reflections of the person who is using the method. And that's always important to keep in mind. That was noted, I think, by a couple of presenters, that the students' interests and the students' own reflexivity would be central. Thirdly, it's important when we do discuss similarities and differences that we're as clear as possible about the level at which we're thinking about these things. So we want to make, want to be clear whether we are thinking about philosophical, analytical, sort of meta-theoretical issues having to do with the underlying logic, or whether we're at the level of just sort of, specific strategies or procedures, things that are more like aids and instruments to the method itself. I also think it's interesting to consider that our understandings of method itself may vary between approaches, and I wonder how it is we're thinking about this. For example, our methods, are these approaches themselves functioning most like rules of procedure? Are they like recipes to follow? Are they mere guidelines, or are they merely suggestions? And so I don't have a clear sense in relation to each of the presenters what the answer to that question would be, but I think it's an important consideration to kind of keep in the background. Now, moving on to some specific dimensions of comparison, I think some of the things that came out is that there's variation in relation to how much emphasis is on emergence of ideas, what we might call theory building, versus elaboration of existing theory. And roughly these correspond to inductive and deductive processes, perhaps, or bottom up and top down, however we want to put it. But I think that even though all the approaches do emphasize some level of emergence, the relation to more deductive processes might vary in each case. Secondly, the relation to quantitative procedures and psychological science is a dimension of difference, I think. Fred brought out the notion of normativity. Heidi noted that grounded theory could be used in the development of questionnaires, whereas others seem to be suggesting that they're doing something that is really quite different from that tradition, and specifically trying to position in opposition to it, I thought, in a certain way. Another important dimension is the formality of the carving up. So I'm saying carving up because let's assume everyone is involved in carving up the data in some way and organizing it in a way that makes sense, and then presenting that to others. The formality of that process seems to vary, whether formal codes are assigned and how they are assigned, what's done with them, how they are arranged, for example, hierarchically or not. Heidi was very explicit about grounded theory involving hierarchical arrangements, whereas Virginia was emphasizing that the arrangement is not hierarchical, for example. I wasn't sure in a couple of other cases what the arrangement would really look like. And it also leads to this other point that really came out for me tonight, which was the importance of this role of visualization. To what extent is visual representation important in the conceptualization of meanings? I thought that was really interesting, and that seems to be something to which there are different answers. Number 5 here, the dimension of particularity. What I mean by that is something like generalization. It relates to generalization, but the question is of what kind? And so the real question is, to what extent is the interest in this person before us? Phil brought that out very clearly in relation to narrative approaches, that the interest is in this person's story. But also there might be interest in the group or category of which that person is part. I won't say, represent, because that has certain meanings, but the group belonging, the group participation, in a sense, might be the focus, versus a phenomenon which is assumed to extend across categories. So I'm thinking in terms of the pandemic, the phenomenon of loneliness or isolation, for example. Fred's work, I think, is clearest in relation to this. So I bring up an example I know of from his work, which is victimization, right? Which is not specific to any particular social group in a sense. 6, how much room is there for deviation or innovation? In other words, to what extent is there room to stray from any kind of orthodoxy? Is there room for adaptation of the method in relation to new contexts or questions or constraints? What are the conditions of practice? This came up a bit at the end, like is teamwork, for example, always important to narrative therapy? It might not be essential, but does it help? What are the conditions that engender insight, like a lively group discussion or interdisciplinary collaboration? And if it is interdisciplinary, with what groups, right? Is it with biologists or with poets? This would be quite a different kind of thing. Or is meditative solitary reflection most conducive to engendering insight? Then finally, this is sort of implicit in everything we've talked about too, but I really think it's a matter of what is emphasized, this kind of continuum from an attempt at description to a more robust embrace of interpretation, the subjectivity of the researcher. And it's really, of course, intertwined, but it's a matter of what is emphasized in the given procedure, I think. But I want to just kind of leave with this question, what do we mean by what is the difference that makes the difference? How do we identify which of these differences are meaningful or important? What is it to make a difference in relation to our approach place? And it suggests a kind of pragmatic framing, I think. Is there some kind of fruit errors, right, when we have differences across methods? But it's really open, I think, to a lot more discussion. So those are really the main things that I wanted to bring out. And again, I just very much appreciate the chance to be part of this wonderful session.
Thank you, Lisa. That's beautifully framed. So maybe in the last 2 minutes we have, we can just ask the panel, do you think you would get different fruit from your approach than others would pick from their approaches? Using Lisa's metaphor.
I've often thought that if I used another method, I would get something like what I do. And if a person using narrative, say, or IPA, or any of the other methods used, say, the Georgie method, they might get something very much like what they would do using the other methods. So I don't know how much the different methods make so much of a difference. I think it's more the investigator and the unique differences among investigators, research problems, procedures, and questions and goals and all the rest of it than the methods per se. That would be my answer to that.
I would say that I agree with Fred that the investigator brings a lot to the types of findings that are being developed, especially if they are aware and thoughtful about the purpose of their studies and what they're trying to do and what their aims are, and have thought about who they are and what they're bringing to the analysis, which I think is a common basis across our approaches. I do think that the organization of data can produce something that's different. Like I wasn't actually saying that granted theory necessarily would produce a survey, but it could produce a measure. You could use the data structure in many different ways. That could be used in mixed method. It could be used in theory. It could be used in advocacy. It could be used in clinical practice. So I think that the structure of what our findings look like may lend themselves in different ways to different kinds of formation. I also think that something that's important to keep in mind is that when we're using terms, a lot of these methods, because they're being used in specific epistemological frameworks, may have reinterpreted some of the terms. So like in critical constructivist grounded theory, terms saturation or consensus have been reinterpreted to make sense in those kinds of framework. So it becomes important to understand how those terms are being used. And there's an excellent special issue of qualitative psychology that is coming out. And Sue Metelsky, who's in the house, wrote a paper I was trying to point out in the chat, doing this kind of work, like questioning terms like member checking and then reinterpreting it in a framework that doesn't carry maybe the kind of post-positivist baggage, but can be seen in different kinds of ways. And there's other papers. I have one kind of epistemic privilege and consensus, but there's, I think, a lot of reinterpreting of common kinds of words and established methods. That's super exciting that's happening now.
I would just to sort of add into that question of the different fruit, and I think, you know, you can have lots of similarities, the fruit you produce, with some of the other methods that are also interested in kind of shared patterning and shared meaning, depending on whether or not your research question is similar. So a version of thematic analysis that looks very much around experience and the interpretation of experience might bear quite a bit of similarity in some ways to IPA, but without the sort of the focus on the individual so much and the idiographic kind of emphasis. And likewise, you know, some versions of grounded theory, which we kind of call grounded theory light, and that they don't kind of go the full way, often produce a sort of similar account. And sometimes a kind of critical and constructionist approach looks very similar to some forms of discourse analytic work. So the sort of similarity and difference, I think, can be overstated. And what's most important is kind of understanding what you're interested in, why, and how it all makes sense, and how your method allows you to claim that that's what you're getting at, you know, to be able to talk about, I'm talking about experience, well, how can you claim that? You know, I'm talking about the construction of meaning, how and why can you claim that, and how does this method and your use of it in particular, or this approach, give you access to that? So those feel like the big important questions in using methods for me, or using approaches for me.
Anybody else want to speak to the difference question? So
I mean, I think
go ahead,
sometimes,
Michael.
sorry, just really quick. I think sometimes the differences are a virtue. You know, we're obviously in a collegiate space here where we're all trying to think and notice the things that we share in common, and that's valuable. But I think also the differences are really helpful sometimes. You know, they get you to different places, and so I would expect the fruit often to be different. Although I completely agree with what Ginny has said, there are certain circumstances where, if you have the same research question and and you've got a choice between one or two methods that would take you down a similar kind of path with that question, the outcomes are not going to be that different. But with our MSc students, we give them the same bit of data to analyze, and they have to do a discourse analysis and an IPA with it, or they have to do Foucauldian work and thematic analysis with it. And those accounts produce really different insights. They're complementary, but they're definitely different. So, I think this diversity is really valuable.
Okay, so I just want to say that there's been a lot of discussion in the chat, and I think we may just end here, because I think people have been talking to each other, and you've been talking to some of the participants, and some of the questions are very specific to method. So I think that we're 10 minutes over, and we maybe just have to say goodbye. And I want to say thank you to all of you for taking this really impossible task of trying to boil complex ideas down to such short time. But from what I'm seeing on the chat, it sounds like nevertheless, those people who have listening found something of value in what you've said. And I think it's been a Herculean effort, and it's really been wonderful. So I thank all of you for your participation, and maybe we'll meet again and continue talking about all these things at some point. So Nisha, it's back to you.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'll just close it up just a couple of minutes, and I'll just start by saying I don't think I'm being hyperbolic when I say that this performance for the past 2 hours that we've all been an audience to might be exactly what the world of qualitative inquiry has been needing. So just a heartfelt thank you to each of you for the real labor of love that you've put into this. And by this, I'm not just meaning this virtual salon. I'm meaning your entire contributions across the duration of your careers to shaping the field of qualitative inquiry as a whole in psychology. Your love for your method, for your participants, and for your students really shines through, and we are all benefiting greatly from it. So just thank you so much. Thank you for all the participants that came today. This is recorded. There's just going to be a little bit of editing, and then it will be up on our website in just a few days. So you can check by Monday and it should be there. And we are going to take a little holiday break as SQUIP, and then we will be returning with virtual salons in the new year. We have a great lineup for you, such as decolonial methods, ethnographic research, aesthetic approaches to qualitative inquiry. So please be on the lookout for some promotional material, both on our listserv. If you are not a member of SQUIP, please sign up at squip.org, and our Facebook group, Society for Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology, as well as squip.org as our website. Okay, take care and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you, everybody. Yay.
Thank you, Nisha, and thanks to everyone. So we're signing off now.